allowed you to record. No, you're recording. Okay, cool.
I'm recording.
Okay, perfect. And I'll go ahead and start mine before we do the whole podcast before it goes. You ready?
All right, ready.
All right. What's going on, everybody? I'm here with Dave Feldman. Thanks for being on, Dave. It's so cool to have you. We're going to talk lipids.
Thanks for having me on, Paul. Lipids. I don't know about this subject.
You want to talk about something else?
Yeah. Let's talk about golf. Wait, I don't know anything about golf either. That won't work.
If you guys don't know Dave, he knows a lot about lipids. And as I will say in the very beginning, we are going to get down and dirty in this episode. We're going to get granular and detailed, but I'm going to do my best and Dave's going to do his best to really make it understandable from the beginning. This is such an interesting thing for me because Dave and I recently went to dinner. We had a dinner at this awesome steak restaurant in Bellevue. I'll give a shout out to Nathan, who was the sponsor of that. We all ate some amazing steaks at that restaurant. And after that steak dinner, I was talking to Dave and he said something that really struck me. And he said, cholesterol is the sharp end of the spear. And I have to agree with that. In the keto and carnivore worlds, I believe that cholesterol, and more specifically elevated LDL, is the sharp end of the spear. I think that this is one of the big stumbling blocks for a lot of people who are doing this. They're feeling great, but they go to their primary doctor and their LDL is through the roof. And so I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Dave and others in the community who are doing their darndest, and I think an incredibly brilliant job to really debunk many of these myths around LDL and why high LDL may not be the end of the world. So let's just dig into it. So Dave, let's just start people at the very beginning. What is LDL? What are we talking about here? When people go to their doctor and they see an LDL of 250, what does that mean? Where do they even start to kind of wrap their head around this equation?
Well, I think the most important place to start is to understand why we have cholesterol at all. And what you'll find is that cholesterol is a molecule exclusively in the animal kingdom. Pretty much if you're some biological system that moves around, then you likely have cholesterol. It gives you these kind of flexible cell walls so that, and cells are what we're built up of, right? We each have about 100 trillion of them, give or take a dozen trillion. And so our bodies are keen to keep this thing constantly getting made and then placed where it needs to be placed to keep us working. And that includes not just, when we start, but as we continue going, if we make new cells, and we definitely do, we need more cholesterol to do that. But on top of that, cholesterol is used with many other things that we may not be aware of, such as bile salts, such as hormones, particularly sex hormones, and many other different functions that are hugely relevant. And that's why the body's also kind of greedy about it. It's very careful to maintain a reservoir of it and doesn't like to get too low on it. In fact, if you don't eat enough cholesterol, your body will try to make up the difference and produce enough of its own cholesterol to make it work. So then the question becomes, well, why then have you only heard of cholesterol in a negative light? It sounds as if when you have lots of cholesterol, that's a bad thing. And what they're usually referring to is cholesterol that's found in the blood. And you don't usually hear just cholesterol. You hear those letters you just mentioned, LDL. What LDL stands for are low-density lipoproteins. And what they mean by that is that last L, lipoproteins, that's lipid-carrying proteins. They carry lipids, and cholesterol is a lipid. And so when they say your LDL is high, what they really mean is the total amount of cholesterol found in all of these carriers, these low-density lipoprotein carriers. When added together, that's high for a certain unit of blood. And what they've found is that there is a loose association between high LDL cholesterol and heart disease. So from that, they stand to conclude, well, this is a good reason for you to avoid things like saturated fat, which can be also associated with having higher LDL, which I 100% concede. I myself, when I'm having more saturated fat, will have higher LDL. I've got plenty of experiments and tests showing that, right? But then the larger question comes back to the one that you just saw my recent presentation on. How much does high LDL associate with risk, particularly when you are being powered by fat?
Right. And as we will dig into the there is more to the equation than just LDL. There's more to the equation than low-density lipoprotein. And as Dave is saying, LDL cholesterol is sort of a carrier. LDL, I should say, low-density lipoprotein is a carrier for the cholesterol molecule, which is a steroid backbone molecule. And then also in an LDL particle is a triglyceride, our triglycerides. So it's a bus, essentially, or a boat that Dave uses in a lot of his talks that carries triglycerides and these cholesterol molecules. As Dave is suggesting, the cholesterol backbone is a precursor for many, many important things in your body: steroid hormones, sex hormones, things like this, and also for the construction of membranes. It goes into the cell membrane and creates rigidity. And also the steroid backbone can be used for many other things. So it's a very useful molecule in the human body. It's something we absolutely cannot live without. So it's incorrectly vilified exclusively. Now, what we do is we start to look at these carrier molecules, or these big sort of LDL buses or boats, and they have these cholesterol and triglyceride molecules inside of them, and they're moving them around the body. And what Dave is sort of hinting at here is this idea that what we see, and many people listening to this may have seen the same illustration in their own cholesterol levels, what we see is that the LDL levels go up. The low-density lipoproteins go up. Generally, the units we use are milligrams per deciliter in most basic panels. We can also measure this in terms of particle number, in which case the units would be nanomole per liter. But the other pieces of that cholesterol panel are the HDL and triglycerides. And as we will see as we dig into this sort of amazing rabbit hole, the real important stuff might be more in the HDL and triglycerides, right, Dave?
I certainly think so. And I want to get this started off on the right foot. So you obviously speak to an audience that you're not afraid to give a lot of technical, not a lot of technical understanding to. And one thing that I want to get people practiced at is to not think of it in the way that it's commonly presented to us, which is that these lipoproteins are the originators of disease or of the solution, for that matter. I contend that actually, for the most part, they are the reflection of the disease, or for that matter, the health, that they can reflect what the state of your system is, including, for example, being powered by fat or being powered by carbs.
And I think that that's really the meat of the issue. That pun always happens, and every time I say it, I regret it a little bit. But there are these sort of divergent things that happen with our lipids and probably with our overall human physiology when we are running on fat versus carbohydrates. And basically what we're talking about in this podcast are changes that almost exclusively happen, or sort of the unique changes that can happen in lipids when we run on fat as fuel. The human is a really unique organism in that it can run on two different fuels, fat or carbohydrates. And what we're talking about here are changes that happen in lipoproteins when we run on fat. This is something that I think both Dave and I would agree is a very evolutionarily consistent thing to do, to run on fat rather than run on carbohydrates. But in terms of the literature in medicine, it's not something that's been studied very much. There's not a whole lot of literature to reflect lipids outcomes of people who are running on fat, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, what's fascinating about it is that there's not a lot of self-awareness that I think is important, not just within the low-carb community, but also in the vegan community, in the Mediterranean community. There's not a lot of populations that said, I'm going to choose this particular diet that's featured in 2019 and live an entire lifetime with that diet. For the most part, diets were never that predefined until now. Now there's actually a kind of adherence protocol that people go with, to where the nature of the composition of the diet, particularly the energy substrates, are what sort of dictate the diet, as opposed to, hey, we're in this country and we have these cuisines that are the most common to this country in our culture, right? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that's a big downside in trying to assess data, because how much can we judge what a low-carb or a low-fat diet is going to be like in terms of big long-term health outcomes? We have to be honest in that we can't know as strongly, besides actually getting blood work back that suggests it. And that's why I'm so interested in blood work, is because a lot of times blood work to me will say things like, for example, whatever diet you're on, if your fasting insulin is low, then I get the sense that you probably are enjoying a greater sense of autophagy, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I see that your triglycerides are low, whether you're on a high carb or low carb diet, I get the sense that you handle the triglycerides in your blood pretty well and probably have lots of turnover. Same thing with glucose. If your glucose is pretty low, especially if it's very low, I can usually tell just from that alone that probably you're pretty athletic. Usually if you have both very low triglycerides and very low glucose, oftentimes I'm going to find that that's something I'm going to see in that. So I don't actually even need to know that much about your diet to get that much of a strong impression. And I'll likely find that that will also reflect a longer lifespan. And that's why I love blood work so much. Blood work is how the system is working, much more than it is that part on the outside that's coming in.
It's sort of popping the hood and looking at the internal workings in a way. You know,
Yes.
it's such a good indication. And, you know, I agree. I think blood work is what we all sort of geek out on. So we kind of hinted at this, but generally speaking, what do you see, and I suspect our experiences will be similar, what do you see in people who are eating with fat as fuel in terms of their lipids, in terms of LDL, HDL, and triglycerides? What is the pattern that we see there?
Well, without question, it's fairly well known at this point that the two greatest commonalities of those people who switch, particularly from a standard American diet over to a low-carb diet, is they often will see their HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, go up, and triglycerides, the measure of fat in the blood, really the measure of fat found in lipoproteins together, will go down. Now, there's some controversy as to whether or not LDL will go up or not. I think most people concede that it can go either direction for many different people. But that said, there's LDL going up, I want to say, for at least a third of the population is, to me, kind of a given. I would say it's probably closer to over 50%. And the only question is to what degree. So for probably most people go on a ketogenic diet, especially, and particularly if they're metabolically healthy, are going to be more likely to see their LDL go up some amount. The question is whether that goes up by a lot. And a lot of my research comes back to the metabolic question, as if you're metabolically flexible, if you're healthy, if I just met you today and you'd never been on a low-carb diet, you said, I'm thinking of going on a low-carb diet, Dave. Will my LDL go up? I would say, I would bet that it will. I would bet that your LDL will go up, and it'll go up substantially. And the reason this wasn't as big of a controversy before is the other end of the spectrum is those people who are either really obese or just very overweight. They lose their weight and come down to still an overweight state, like they would say, hey, I still have weight to lose. They are more likely to see their LDL go down relative to those people already like leaner and fitter. And that this again all kind of plays into, you know, what I like to call the lipid energy model, which makes sense to me because basically it means that you're trafficking more of these fatty acids for fuel. And if you are, you're trafficking them in something called a VLDL, a very low density lipoprotein, which is a precursor to LDL. And therefore it makes sense why if you're being powered more by VLDLs, or more specifically the cargo of triglycerides on VLDLs, you'll end up with more LDLs.
Right. And so you have this figure in many of your talks. I would refer people probably to the talk you did from Low Carb Salt Lake recently, which I thought was excellent. But there is this idea that there are multiple particles here, and I think people often get lost in the alphabet soup, you know? So maybe we should just explain to people what the different particles are, you know, chylomicron, VLDL, IDL, LDL, and it might make more sense to them. But you sort of talked about that a little bit. So just so people understand sort of the lineage of particles, let's just dig into that for a second.
Sure. Let's start with chylomicrons. You just talked about those. And it's a little frustrating to me because the vernacular is a little inconsistent here. Chylomicrons are the only lipoprotein that doesn't have an L in its name. It's just called chylomicrons. But what they are is they are the lipoproteins made by your intestines. They're actually made from food you just ate. So think of a chylomicron as a very large, the largest of the boats of lipoproteins that your body makes. It packages in a lot of triglycerides. again, from food you just ate, and it packages them in at the gut, makes it through, it's actually some special cells known as enterocytes, which ultimately package these up and deliver them into the lymph. And eventually, as they make it through the lymphatic system, they get released through the, I forget the name of this, the thoracic duct. Is that what I want to say?
The thoracic duct, yep.
Yes. And it's actually a fun fact to know and tell. Your skeletal muscle and your cardiac muscle prefer fatty acids, particularly direct fatty acid delivery. And your cardiac muscle gets first dibs. So as that comes in, it's like, oh, fatty acids, cool, because I'm kind of the most important muscle in this body. So I want to be sure I'm well supplied, right? And as that comes in, chylomicrons are sort of special in that even though they start so big, they very quickly start dropping off all their triglycerides. And lipoproteins, as they drop off their triglycerides, they get smaller. It's kind of like a balloon releasing air. And so as they drop off their triglycerides, they get smaller and smaller. And then within 30 minutes to an hour at most, they are absorbed by the liver. The liver is the one that takes them up. Now that's from food you just ate. And the energy model I present emphasizes how importantly your body is in a counterbalance with that food you just ate. So if I'm eating a lot of fat, then my body feels less of a need to mobilize existing fat that's on my body. And therefore, it makes less of its counterpart to chylomicrons, which are the VLDLs. Mm-hmm. VLDLs come from the liver. But the cargo that are on the VLDLs ultimately, mostly, came from your existing fat stores. So let's say that I go out and I exercise like crazy and I don't eat anything. My fat stores release free fatty acids. They get released into the bloodstream. They bind to a very prominent protein in your bloodstream known as albumin. And some of that will be absorbed by adjacent tissues, but about half of it will eventually make its way to the liver. Liver will pick it up and then package them into these VLDLs and then just send them right back out again. And this is actually important because a lot of people need to understand this. Your body has a very important engineering task that I highly appreciate. It's actually a very challenging one. Imagine you have a car that doesn't have one fuel tank. It has 100 trillion fuel tanks. And you need to keep all of those fuel tanks topped off at all times. None of those fuel tanks can get down to zero. So the engineering challenge is you need to make fuel available on demand at all times. Your body is very good at that. And so these VLDLs, the reason they would package these up and not just like leave it in the bloodstream indefinitely is because these are big resuppliers. So if I'm like, working out, say just my hand like crazy, right? It may seem crazy that there's fat around here, but there's adipose tissue in and around here. So if I'm using a lot of adjacent fat stores, ultimately other parts of my body's other fat stores will help pitch in the resupply of these fat stores back here. That's why we never quite seem to be completely lopsided on the fat, even if we can be lopsided on muscle when it comes to subcutaneous adipose tissue, right? The fat that's all around our body. Because it's a constant resupply strategy. And that's super, super important. So getting back to the lipoproteins, VLDL is constantly doing the resupply. And of all of the particles in your body, the VLDL needs to be constantly churned back out again. And it'll only be downregulated when there's already existing food-based fat coming in. And that's what gets us to the inversion pattern. So the inversion pattern is something that was the first thing that I noticed in my research going back almost 3 years ago. And I saw that if I ate a lot of fat, I would have less LDL cholesterol. That seems so odd. But conversely, if I didn't eat a lot of fat, especially if I fasted or I just brought down the total calories, well, then my LDL cholesterol would go up. And it was in this perfect seesaw, perfect back and forth, right? Well, getting back to the analogy, if I'm not eating a lot of fat, what happens? Well, my body needs to activate more lipolysis. My insulin goes down, my glucagon goes up, more of those free fatty acids then are making their way to the liver. More VLDL is back in supply. to compensate for the lack of chylomicrons. And therefore, the constant resupply of those triglycerides back to my tissues means there's more leftover succeeding LDLs, and therefore more LDL cholesterol. And this is super important because I think a lot of people don't think of this inventory of cholesterol as recirculating. They think of it as just completely synthesized out of nowhere every time. They think anytime you're taking cholesterol from the blood, it was like just made a few minutes ago. And the truth is no, actually the liver can recirculate cholesterol as much as it wants. There's no way to actually know very easily without tracer studies, but we do know that there's any number of laps, if you will, that cholesterol can make, getting back to why it's so greedy with cholesterol. Now, once it comes into LDL, that's one other particle, but let's go ahead and talk about HDL real quick. So HDL is pretty exciting because when it gets made, it's also made by the liver, and it's made in its nascent form, which is kind of like a flat cookie, if you will. And when it comes out, it's called nascent because it's delipidated. It has no lipids in it. And as it heads out, it's looking for places where it can actually go and capture more contents to put on board. This is, of course, usually described in literature as reverse cholesterol transport because it'll find places in your tissue that do have cholesterol and pack it on board and then take it out, right? But as it happens, there's also ways it can get contents on board through, we're just going to head just a little geekier now, and something you'll hear about from time to time called CETP, which is cholesterol ester transfer proteins, which is kind of like a bridge between HDL and very low density lipoproteins or low density lipoproteins, and they'll do like exchange of contents and a whole bunch of stuff. Bottom line is this: all of these lipoproteins actually are constantly engaged with each other and your tissues. It's very chatty, but it's not often described that way. It's described as though they're just kind of markers on their own and they just kind of do their own thing. And what their levels are will tell you about what diseases they are driving. And that's a problem, because if you don't look at this like the intricate system I'm trying to kind of convey, then it's easy to see why it is we keep stumbling on the same problems.
It's all in flux.
Yes, very much.
And so I'll sum it up, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you eat fat, and your body, the cells in your gut, they will take the fat, they'll put it into chylomicrons, and those will circulate in the lymphatic system. So those don't go directly into the bloodstream. They go into the lymphatic system, which is a system of lymph vessels, which are different than blood vessels. People may not know, but they have blood vessels, which are arteries and veins, which we'll talk about later. But they also have lymph vessels, and that's a network. And those all empty into the thoracic duct, which is sort of this collecting duct for all of the lymph or chyme. And that empties into the superior vena cava. And that is where it goes into the heart. And then all of that chyme from the lymphatic system goes into the bloodstream. And like you were saying, those chylomicrons can get used immediately because the heart likes that triglyceride-rich tissue. Those are triglycerides. That's not necessarily, I guess that could also be cholesterol, right? There could be cholesterol or triglycerides in chylomicrons.
Yes, so we haven't really gotten into cholesterol absorption by cells yet. We were mainly just talking about it from the energy perspective. But since you're touching on it, I will say this. The reason, certainly there's some controversy here, but I would state plainly that the reason the body is keen to put cholesterol in these same boats is so that they can be made available for cells. Mm-hmm. And yes, that includes cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle does do endocytosis as well. All of these cells, they have LDL receptors, specifically for doing endocytosis of LDL.
Right. So
that's a way by which they can further gain cholesterol, is off of these lipoproteins. So anyway, not to interrupt, but yes, I should actually make a technical point here. I'm not sure about endocytosing of chylomicrons. I believe they can't be bound to LDL receptors because of the, let me get super technical here for a sec. They have an ApoB48 as opposed to LDL having an ApoB100. And it's actually called that because it's 48% of the mass of the other apolipoprotein. because of that, it can't bind to LDL. But I say it's a technical because we're still learning about other receptors other than LDL that can bind to these APOs, including ApoB, that can potentially still make use of it.
And when we're talking about the apolipoproteins, this gets a little confusing for people. So when we're talking about chylomicrons with ApoB48 and LDL with ApoB100, these are, I think of these, Dave is saying boats, I think of them as just hollow balls. They're single layer lipid membranes, and they're full of triglyceride and cholesterol. And they have these sort of marker proteins on them, which identify them as LDL with ApoB100 or chylomicron with ApoB48. And then, as you described, the HDL is essentially a hollow cookie that's flat and then moves around and becomes a ball as it gets filled with the lipid throughout the body. And HDL has a different apolipoprotein. It's A1, right? Apolipoprotein A1.
And A2. Some have just one, but for the most part, they have those two.
And so sometimes people will see these lipoprotein particles identified by their apolipoproteins, B100, et cetera. So it gets confusing, but if people are looking at
it gets even more confusing than that. Since we're touching on apolipoproteins, I just have to mention this. ApoB is the only non-exchangeable apolipoprotein. In other words, it will live with that lipoprotein for its lifespan. But then there's a whole bunch of apolipoproteins that are exchangeable. And that's why I kind of paused a little bit when you were mentioning HDL, is even though A1 and A2 are very predominantly on HDL, it can also have on it, for example, ApoE and ApoC2, and assign those to VLDLs, almost in a kind of like a docking procedure, if you will, to say, okay, you're good to go, you have enough triglycerides, let's go ahead and make sure you have an ApoC2 on it. Because if you have that ApoC2, other cells can bind to that are specifically asking for energy. And so it's kind of like a matchmaking process. It's actually really amazing. It's very sophisticated. So if you were to, like, imagine we're in a big, dark hedge maze of canals. And all you could do is you could just reach an arm out and say, hey, I'm looking for food. How can I get food? How great would it be if you could just like put a special hook on your arm that will only tether to those things that happen to have food. So the thing that tethers it is placed on those things that have the food, and then some other boat goes, oh, it looks like you're out of food. I'm going to go and take that tethering hook off so that, the other pawls won't mistakenly bind to you when it can't be used. But you see what I'm getting to. What I'm getting to is this is very much, without question to me, this is very much predominantly an energy distribution system. But I also don't want to belittle it by saying that, because it does so many things more than that. It's just without question, if you're looking at it from an activity level, no question, it is distributing triglycerides constantly and effectively.
And it's so interesting. So we get chylomicrons coming from the intestines. They go through the lymphatic system. They get eventually into the bloodstream, picked up by the heart, picked up by the liver. Then the liver takes the triglycerides out. The liver makes VLDL, exports the VLDL to the system. VLDL becomes IDL, intermediate density lipoprotein, which becomes LDL, low density lipoprotein. And then, the liver is also making HDL, which goes out and kind of does all this flux between the different boats, right?
Yes.
Okay. So at this point, what is the concern with LDL? This gets us into the idea of the lipid. I want to talk about what the lipid hypothesis is and why doctors get worried about people having lots of LDL molecules in their blood. Because what we're describing is a molecule, low density lipoprotein. It's a ball, it's a boat, it's full of triglycerides and cholesterol. It has ApoB100 as an apolipoprotein on it. It's doing this energy transfer. It also has roles in immunologic functioning. It is involved in preventing, the trafficking of lipopolysaccharide and lipoteichoic acid in the body, which are substances from gram-negative bacteria. So it's doing all these important things. What has happened? Why do physicians, why do my colleagues get worried when there's a lot of LDL around? What is this lipid hypothesis, and how do we sort of think maybe this isn't correct?
Well, certainly there are people who know the history a lot stronger than I do. I definitely recommend checking out Gary Taubes and Nina Teicholz, both their books and their lectures. They get into how there really was kind of a catalyst event that really put it into the forefront in our country, and it was when we had a sitting president get a heart attack. And it was a huge mystery. Why would this 3-pack-a-day smoking president have a heart attack? What was the grand mystery? And of course, at that time, smoking was much more well appreciated, and nobody wanted to attack that. So they ultimately came to two general opinions. One that was much more prominent. The other one was that it was saturated fat, which was coming from Ansel Keys, of course. And I'm going to forget the other scientist's name, so I'm not going to name him unless you know his name. But he was saying it actually seems to be sugar is a very strong association. I want to say it's Young, but I'm not sure on that.
Not sure.
Anyway, that debate was hardly even a debate. Basically, Ansel Keys won the battle. There's a very famous Time cover that shows Ansel Keys in the heart, and that solidified the what's known as the Lipid Hypothesis. And at that time, they were looking just at total cholesterol predominantly. But what helped to make it very intuitive is that when you cut open arteries that have been clogged, you find that indeed there is cholesterol in those arteries, things that they call fatty streaks, which is basically the first visible sign that there actually is atherosclerosis being the buildup of plaque in the arteries. And because of that, it seemed pretty obvious that, well, actually, and I should say this, Ansel Keys was first saying just don't ingest cholesterol. Eventually that morphed into saturated fat in particular seems to increase cholesterol in the blood. But regardless, whatever brought in more cholesterol in the blood was likely a culprit from their perspective as to why it is that you would die more from heart disease. Now, I want to emphasize something right now. I think on a low-carb, high-fat diet that I'm going to be more likely to die of heart disease than not, with a very important emphasis on something. That's the what I die of, not the when I die. In other words, if my being on this diet prevents me from dying of cancer at 60 so that I could die of a heart attack by 80, one would be correct by saying, in other words, your diet absolutely increased your chance of dying of a heart attack. That's technically accurate, right? And this is why in the speech that I did on risk, and why with everybody I talk to, I keep driving things back to all-cause mortality. Seeing that one group is dying of one particular thing more than the other group doesn't tell me much at all, because you could increase the risk of dying by something that's not that thing, which will necessarily mean they die less of the thing that's being focused on. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's very relevant to where we're going in this discussion, because you're asking why it is that people would be afraid of heart disease when they have high levels of cholesterol in the blood. And I'm already starting with well, wait a sec, before we can even look at heart disease, let's look at how the whole balance sheet appears. I don't want to just look at heart disease. I want to look at heart disease relative to everything else, because there's one key thing that keeps getting missed, which is there a reason that LDL could be beneficial in the body? Because if there's any benefit to LDL toward your outcome and mortality that doesn't have to do with cardiovascular disease, that has to be talked about. But that doesn't get talked about, does it?
It never gets talked about. As you note in your talk from Keto Salt Lake or Low Carb Salt Lake, most of the focus in the studies is on cardiovascular death, not on all-cause mortality. And you have a great slide in there from a study of Japanese, I believe it was Japanese men, that showed that when they were stratified by LDL levels.
It's both, by the way. It's both men and women.
Both men and women, yeah. When they looked at LDL levels, those with higher levels of LDL had better, meaning lower all-cause mortality, but they had a slightly higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. Am I quoting that correctly?
That is exactly right. In fact, I really emphasize it strongly. I point out why it is, and I definitely encourage your listeners to, maybe you could put in your show notes.
Yeah.
Check out this graph, because it's a great bar graph. You see both male and female. You see that going from left to right, left being the low LDL, and I believe they went by quintiles, so 5 at a time, up to high LDL. that you see that all-cause mortality generally goes down. And for women, it stepwise goes down every single one, right? But the worst place you can be for all-cause mortality is all the way to the left with the lowest LDL. You just don't want to be that in it. But in that same set of bar charts, you can see cardiovascular disease mortality stepwise increases. So the what you die of is more likely to be cardiovascular disease, but the dying altogether goes down. And as I emphasized in the talk, that's unintuitive. We love to identify something and say, oh, this one thing you're going to die less of. And the analogy I bring in, I think it's a great analogy, is just to say, look, if I invented a pill that cures cancer, I said, Paul, I got this great pill, cures cancer. Can you believe that? It's not intuitive for your next question to be, oh, now wait a sec. What diseases will it cause that I'll die of instead, right?
Or sooner.
Or sooner, correct.
Because that's really what we're looking at here. And people are probably a little confused by this, and I promise we will make some statements in the next minute or two that will clarify all of this for people. But what Dave is saying is that when we look at these studies, the all-cause mortality is generally lower in people with high LDL, but the cardiovascular disease goes up. So the problem is that many studies focus only on cardiovascular disease and not on all-cause mortality. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So, even when they have it as an endpoint that they had to have, such as a drug study, they have to have all-cause mortality in there. They will de-emphasize it. It will not. It will be all about the cardiovascular disease outcome and not about the all-cause mortality.
And so one of the things I wanted to do at the beginning of this podcast was give people a little bit of the lay of the land and the context with lipoproteins. And right now, what I'm going to do is skip ahead 6 chapters and tell people a little bit about how I believe, and you'll have to let me know if you disagree with this, the LDL molecule actually participates in atherosclerosis and why we may be seeing this trend and why even in these studies we show an increase in cardiovascular disease, why I don't think that's a big deal and why we shouldn't even worry about that, right? So there's this great phrase, and it may have been Peter Attia that said this, necessary but not sufficient, right?
Yeah, so I credit Attia with that. I love that quote.
So I would say that from my perspective, the LDL molecule is necessary but not sufficient for the development of the atherosclerotic plaque. And what I will sort of lay out for people, and I just want to make this distinction right now so they're understanding, because I think what we've discussed so far might get people worried, that in my perspective, the LDL molecule can absolutely participate in the development of the atherosclerotic plaque, meaning it's there, it participates. But it I'm just going
to correct you slightly, because you keep saying the LDL molecule. You mean to say the cholesterol from an LDL molecule is what you probably mean to say. Or do you mean an LDL particle?
Well, I'm actually thinking of the LDL particle going into the subendothelial space, getting taken up by the macrophages with the scavenger receptors and forming the beginning of a foam cell and a fatty streak. Am I thinking about that incorrectly?
No, that's fine. I just want to be sure that you're laying it out the way that you mean to.
Okay. So and that's one of the things I think we should be careful of, because I think from now on in the podcast, when we say cholesterol, we will mean the actual cholesterol molecule rather than blood cholesterol. So we'll mean the actual cholesterol molecule, the steroid backbone of cholesterol, and I'll do my best to say, when we say LDL, we'll mean the LDL lipoprotein particle, which carries cholesterol and triglycerides. But the reason, this is the idea, it's necessary but not sufficient. I believe there's evidence that the LDL sort of lipoprotein molecule is participating in the formation of the atherosclerotic plaque. I think, and this is something I believe we will lay out in this talk as we dive in, that the LDL molecule is necessary but not sufficient to form an atherosclerotic plaque. It is not the LDL molecule or the LDL particle that is causing the formation of an atherosclerotic plaque. It is being incorporated into the atherosclerotic plaque. And so the reason I want to emphasize this is because this kind of makes sense, right? It kind of gets to this underlying issue. Okay, if the LDL molecule is participating in the formation of the atherosclerotic plaque, what is the proximate event? And I think we'll get to this, the idea that it's probably endothelial dysfunction that is the main issue here, rather than the LDL particle. And it'll make sense when we talk about the lipid hypothesis. And I apologize if I'm not explaining this as clearly as I could. But in people who have endothelial dysfunction, I would suggest, and I'll see if Dave agrees with me, that a higher LDL will provide more substrate for the formation of an atherosclerotic plaque. But it is that underlying endothelial dysfunction that is the main problem rather than the LDL particle itself. And so what we see across these people is that generally most people in our population have underlying endothelial dysfunction, right? 85% of the population is overweight and obese. In Japan, perhaps the number is slightly different. But I think that in general, in westernized cultures, even though Japan is in the East, they're eating in a Western fashion now. In modernized cultures, the majority of people are metabolically unhealthy, and I would argue the majority of people have a dysfunctional endothelium. Therefore, when you raise LDL, you may see cardiovascular disease increase, but that doesn't mean that it was the LDL that caused it. The LDL is participating. And so hopefully that helps people understand sort of, we're skipping ahead 6 chapters, we'll get there, but I wanted to explain that in the context of what we're saying here. The LDL molecule, the LDL particle, also does many valuable things in the body. Like I said, it's involved in immunologic function. It's involved in formation of cell membranes. And I believe, and Dave, you can echo this if you feel like it's true, I believe that that is why when LDL goes up, we see decreased all-cause mortality. There are clearly many beneficial things for an LDL molecule. But if we have underlying endothelial dysfunction, it could contribute to that. And the bottom line is, and we'll talk about this too, how do we avoid endothelial dysfunction? Did that make sense, Dave? Did I lay that out in a reasonable way?
It did, and I think I can offer an analogy that'll really help clarify. And it's a new analogy I really like.
Dave is a master of analogies, if you guys haven't noticed. He loves, and I love him for it. So yeah, let's hear the new one.
It helps to get a complex concept across, at least to what you're trying to outline. So you were a hospitalist at one point, or no?
I was a PA in cardiology, and now I'm just in the last weeks of my residency at the University of Washington in psychiatry.
So if you lived down the road from a hospital, you would probably feel a little more secure that you had a hospital nearby in case you ran into a serious issue or your family members ran into a serious issue, right?
Yeah.
But you likewise acknowledge that there is such a thing as hospital error. There can be a mistake made, and that can result in injury or even death. That's a possibility, right? But you're making a cost-benefit analysis. You're going, okay, knowing what I know up to this point, I think it's absolutely an acceptable risk for me to send somebody to the hospital because I think it's just more likely it's going to turn out positive than negative, right? Okay, now let's change this up a little bit. Let's say that there's a sudden disaster that's in your neighborhood. There's an earthquake, followed by a volcano hits it, followed by there's a tidal wave, right? And now all of a sudden the hospital is getting overrun. You get called in, every doctor's on hand, they're doing the best they can with a terrible situation. Do you believe accidental hospital deaths are going to go up?
Yes.
They definitely will go up, right? People are getting overworked, but they're doing the best they can with what they have. Would you now stop going to that hospital because you're thinking, oh, well, now they're stressed out, they're overrun. It'd just be better off to, let my grandmother hang here and have little care at all, right? Relative to what is the hospital, because the hospital is going to still have at-risk care relative to where they usually are. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think most people would say, no, I'll still take my chances with the hospital where the overworked, highly tired medical professionals are, because I still think the cost benefit turns out to be better there than for me to take care of them. I realize this analogy didn't totally work since you're a doctor. So obviously if you're seeing your grandma, then that might be different. But you see where I'm going with this. The overworked hospital analogy makes it clear that you can have a situation that could be a situation of care for which even life-saving measures can be more deadly on the balance than they would be otherwise, but are still beneficial overall, right? So then the question becomes, all right, should we focus on what brought the natural disaster? And then we see a very easy way to determine if you actually do have just a greater level of incompetence with the hospital down the street. And that's how well it functions when there isn't a natural disaster, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so then do we find people with high LDL and low cardiovascular risk markers that are more predominantly associated with cardiovascular risk then LDL, having high rates of cardiovascular disease. Does that make sense?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, right?
It absolutely is. I would say it's the multi-billion-dollar question.
Right. And just to clarify, what Dave is asking there is, do we find people who have high LDL and high HDL and low triglycerides, which Dave has sort of coined the triad, right? So we're presupposing that high HDL, low triglycerides are an indication of insulin sensitivity and relative metabolic health. Do we find that in people who have that triad of high LDL, high HDL, and high triglycerides, do we find that they have high or low cardiac events, right? That is the multi-billion-dollar question. Is that right, Dave? Yeah.
You did, and we have a cohort that's emerged for us. It's a cohort that I'm very close to, and it's who I consider to be representing one end of the spectrum of those people who have gone on a low-carb diet and see their LDL not go up a little bit, but go up so high that it's comparable to those people who have a disease known as familial hypercholesterolemia. So we're talking LDL of not just 140. The starting level of those people who have this is 200. So an LDL of 200, 300, I've seen 600. Yeah, I think there's even somebody in the group that's 700, right?
But they have LDL, not a total,
right,
an LDL.
LDL, right. But they likewise tend to have HDL that is super high, usually starting at 80 and going up. Many of them with super high levels of LDL will have an HDL even as high as, like, say, 130, 140, 150. And very low levels of triglycerides. But that's not all. That's not all. They seem to, almost like without knowing anything else, Paul, you know these guys, they'll turn around those lipids, and almost like magic, you can start to imagine what they look like. Those lipids usually mean that they are lean, typically athletic, and often it's indicative that they are truly low carb. So there aren't a lot of people who have this lipid profile that are like 100 grams of carbs or more.
Right.
But on top of that, usually just from those lipids alone, I can already guess their blood pressure is low. Their fasting insulin is low.
What do we mean by low for fasting insulin? Like, what kind of levels do you see?
Like usually 5 or less.
Yeah, 3, right. 2, I've seen, yeah.
I've seen many that have like 1 or 2, but I don't want other people to get this to start getting competitive about that.
Right.
But it's not surprising, and it gets back to what you just said. The reason I like pointing to low triglycerides and high HDL is it's a loose proxy for insulin sensitivity and typically just hypoinsulinemia. There's just low levels of insulin in the blood. And so we're not just talking about high LDL or even just high LDL and high HDL and low triglycerides. We're talking about all these other great cardiovascular risk markers where everything's breaking their way except LDL. So this one cohort is the key to everything. It's why I'm trying so hard to get a long-term follow-up study on them, because if in fact there is any legs to the lipid hypothesis that high cholesterol in the blood means more death.
High LDL, right? Well, LDL.
Yeah, high LDL.
High LDL, yeah.
Yeah, then these people should be dropping like flies.
Right.
And I don't want to sound, flippant about it. On the contrary, I feel these are the things that keep me up at night. I want to know myself, because it's not just the adults. I predicted in my original article on these people who I call lean mass hyperresponders, that this will likewise apply to children. Children of the low-carb diet are probably going to be more likely to have this phenotype, because I was following it to its logical conclusion. Many of them are going to be very lean. They're going to be high metabolism. Kids are going to have higher metabolism. And if they're very low carb, they likely see this lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. So certainly we want to know if, in fact, this is at high risk. Thus far, I'm cautiously optimistic about it, but I got to be a good scientist. We'll see.
And that's what we're going to dig into, all that stuff. And we sort of hinted at it. Let's talk to people a little bit about the flip side. Let's really tell people, I just want to make sure people understand what the lipid hypothesis is, which is the other end of the equation. So basically what we're doing here is Dave and I agree, and this is sort of Dave's work, that this profile of high LDL, high HDL, and low triglycerides in the setting of people who are lean mass hyperresponders, athletic, good blood pressure, low fasting insulin, this is a different way to have high LDL than people with familial hypercholesterolemia or people who are metabolically unwell. And so, but this is it's running into the lipid hypothesis, and which is why most physicians are freaking out. So what is the lipid hypothesis, and why do most physicians worry when people come to them with an LDL of 250?
Right. So this would be kind of like part two of what I was saying before with Ansel Keys. The assumption is that these lipoproteins, these LDLs, they are particularly at larger quantities. They're kind of just crashing into your cells that line the vessel walls, known as the endothelial cells, particularly in the arteries. And so because of that, they're slowly eroding their way into the vascular wall and creating more and more plaque. And the story as it's described is often that it's just progressive, like there's no regressiveness to it. It's just they often refer to, and I mentioned this in the talk, a lifetime burden, lipoprotein burden, that the more that there is and at the higher and higher gradient, the worse the potential outcome for people. But that's why I want to kind of bring it back to the hospital analogy. Is this really that we're seeing a reflection of high LDL being there for itself being the driver of the disease? Or is it possible that LDL in any way participates in the response to disease? And that's where I want to kind of give the counter hypothesis.
Right.
The counter hypothesis is actually LDL is part of the recruitment for dealing with the disease, particularly endothelial damage and dysfunction, for which there actually is quite a lot of evidence already in the literature that suggests this. For example, the two easiest ones to mention, and probably one of the largest ones, you had mentioned earlier lipopolysaccharides. That's in the wake of injecting, and I think this happens with animal models, and actually they may have done this with human models, where they had a certain amount of lipopolysaccharides injected into the blood. The liver upregulates low-density lipoprotein secretion. It may even be direct lipoprotein secretion, low-density lipoprotein secretion. But regardless, it's bringing these out to potentially fight the disease. A lot of people don't know this, but ApoB-containing lipoproteins also carry on board alpha-tocopherol, which we tend to know as vitamin E, which is in fact something that can connect with free radicals in our bloodstream, reactive oxygen species, and turn them into non-reactive products. It's an antioxidant, and it's carried on board low-density lipoproteins. There's something that I bring up from time to time. I still can't believe it. I genuinely can't. For the 4 years that I've been on a ketogenic diet, I've not had one bacterial or viral sickness of any kind. Not even a cold. There's one time I thought I had a cold, and I ultimately had to update and change it again. And I've been anxious to get one so I could get sick data, right? But Paul, I can't emphasize this enough. My entire life, I've had at least a cold every year. Usually the flu or something like that every other year. And when I first moved here to Vegas, the first 7 years I was here, I got bronchitis 3 times. 3 times. In the last 4 years, I haven't gotten anything at all. Now, I don't know how much of that is just the keto diet versus how much it might just be higher levels of lipoproteins, but I'm leaning towards the latter given all the things I've learned. And granted, I only mentioned the antioxidant defense. Lipoproteins themselves bind to pathogens as part of the potential clearance pathway, right? So here's why I'm going with this on the recruitment side. So I mentioned the cytokines could signal, or maybe I didn't mention the cytokines. A damaged endothelial cell will release cytokines. It's kind of like a molecular call for help. Our cells already have them on hand. It's like think of the break glass for, getting the fire extinguisher. That's the alarm, right? And the cytokines can ultimately, at a certain threshold point, have the liver upregulate more lipoproteins again, potentially. And there are other things like, for example, damaged cells, especially endothelial cells, expressing more LDL receptors in the presence of growth factor, like platelet-derived growth factor. This is all super relevant because it suggests that there's specific pathways in a call for help to low-density lipoproteins in particular. That cannot be understated because if you don't have studies that can successfully disentangle what amount the body was calling for low-density lipoproteins, you've got the problem of trying to blame deaths in the hospital on the hospital itself, right? You see the problem here. And that's why there's this other theory called response to injury, or even chronic endothelial injury. As in, if you've got dysfunctional or damaged endothelial cells, especially an endothelium itself, you have inflammation that continually goes, and you have the overworked endothelium ultimately getting thrombotic, and ultimately you end up with heart disease.
Right. And so the two theories that we're contrasting here are the lipid hypothesis, which basically says the more LDL, the worse, because LDL is causing atherosclerosis by banging into the endothelium. The endothelial cells are the cells that line blood vessels. They line veins and arteries, and they're very thin. And so the lipid hypothesis is concerned, or people who espouse the lipid hypothesis are concerned about higher levels of LDL in the blood because they believe that it's essentially directly related. You know, it's a concentration.
Driving the disease.
What's that?
It's driving the disease.
Yep. The concentration of LDL is driving the atherosclerosis by banging into endothelial cells, getting between endothelial cells. Therefore, the more LDL particles you have in your body, the more atherosclerosis you will have, right? Now, Dave, and I would agree with Dave strongly, and I think what we will show clearly here is that there's a strong case to be said that's not the case. That can't be the case for many reasons. These LDL molecules may be part of an atherosclerotic plaque, but they are probably almost certainly not the inciting event. They are not the catastrophe in Dave's analogy. They are not the proximate event. And the competing hypothesis, or one of the competing hypotheses, is the endothelial injury hypothesis, the idea that perhaps arterial plaque is the result of LDL particles being placed there purposefully as a repair mechanism because there is endothelial injury, that the body is actually asking for LDL particles to do some sort of repair. And rather than the LDL particles coming in and causing the injury, they are there to repair an injury. Did I state that properly, Dave?
You did. I will state this up front. I try to be a good scientist and say these two theories, while they compete with each other, aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Right. It is possible that the lipid hypothesis is correct at some threshold level, at some particular circumstance that's not been fully well explored yet, etc. I leave that as a possibility. I'm just very doubtful of it. You know, we talked a little bit offline, and my issue is that the physics of it don't work out. When I was first learning about this, like so many others, I thought lipoproteins, once I learned that they were these, just giant balls, and all I can see for a frame of reference is this picture and just these balls filling the picture, I'm thinking of them as just like, loading up my bloodstream, particularly the higher I get in them. And then I really sat down and I did the math. The volume of what 5 liters of blood for like an adult male like myself might have. And then I actually calculated up the volume of a low density lipoprotein, which is around, I want to say 22.5 in diameter, something along those lines. And then I added it all together and ultimately found out that 2,000 nanomoles, which is probably close to what I have, 2,000 nanomoles would take up about 1/5,000th of my total blood volume. So about 2% of 1% of all of the blood I have, right? Because they're that small, even in the aggregate. But then on top of that, I looked at what their mass comparison is. The tiny little monolayer, teeny tiny thing compared to an endothelial cell, it's this small. An endothelial cell is one gigantic. It's like this. It's almost like a bus on the state of Wyoming, right? The bus is the low density lipoprotein, and the state of Wyoming is the surface of an endothelial cell, a bilayer.
Comparing the size of an LDL, because an LDL particle is usually 22 nanometers in diameter, and as we talked about, an endothelial cell might be orders of magnitude greater than that, hundreds, thousands of times larger than an LDL molecule.
And again, if you want to start picking on things that have greater mass or size, you have red blood cells, which are gigantic, right? Red blood cells are so massive that they can even have to go single file through capillaries because they're just so gigantic, right? And that's, again, this is why the physics never quite worked out for me. But on top of that, you have a greater association of atherogenesis with those VLDLs I mentioned earlier, which are larger sized than LDLs. Again, they were already bloated with triglycerides. And yet, if you have higher and higher VLDL, that's why they now include them in a lot of modern lipid panels, because if your VLDL is high, which means you likely have greater remnants, then you have a greater risk of cardiovascular death. Well, this again kind of flies in the face of what we think of as the lipid hypothesis. Why would these larger ones that are more buoyant, that because they're called very low density lipoproteins because they have a lot more triglycerides, so they have a lot, they're not as dense. And again, a lot of these narratives, they just don't quite jive. They don't quite make sense to me. I think that we're seeing the higher association with VLDLs because that's more likely a broken system.
Exactly.
Broken system in that you're going to have more VLDLs if there's a lack of capability for them to park their energy. And we haven't gotten into it yet, but I definitely believe very strongly in maxing out like your personal fat threshold to where you now have nowhere to park the energy. And so you're building up ectopic fat, placing fat into tissue that doesn't need it. That's highly associated with cardiovascular disease. And I can understand why. That's where you start having a breakdown in the way that you're even managing your energy, which is hugely problematic. It's something you want to definitely take care of. And that's why, like, I want to see, like in the case of these lean mass hyperresponders, they're on the other end of the spectrum. They have these super high levels of LDL, but we're getting other cardiovascular markers like carotid intima media thickness tests. We're getting CAC, and I want to keep these going. I'd like to get them in a real, long-term follow-up study for that. But anyway, I kind of digress. I sort of went off the mark there, but you get the point. The point is the lipid hypothesis, as described right now, is sort of difficult for me to follow through. And I think while the response to injury hypothesis or chronic endothelial injury hypothesis just makes a lot more sense the more I've been getting into it.
And so I just want to recap this for people so they have a sense of what we're talking about here. An LDL particle, I might have said an LDL molecule, but again, we're talking about low density lipoprotein. There are these balls. They're 22 nanometers in diameter. Endothelial cells are micrometers, multiple orders of magnitude larger, hundreds of thousands of times larger. And the space between endothelial cells is about 70 nanometers. So the idea of the lipid hypothesis, and I guess all of this boils down to what is the proximate event? And proximate or proximal is a word we use a lot in medicine. What is the originating event? What is the inciting event that causes atherosclerosis to happen? Is it, as the lipid hypothesis would suggest, that extra LDL causes atherosclerosis, or is it something else? The endothelial injury hypothesis would say it's an injury to the endothelium. I think there are other theories which are quite compelling, which would say it's endothelial dysfunction. I think the endothelial injury hypothesis is essentially, it's sort of synonymous with the idea that there's endothelial dysfunction. Below the endothelial cells, so if you're looking at a blood vessel in cross-section, the endothelial cell is the inside. Below that is the intima, and sort of the subintimal space is where the atherosclerotic plaque happens. That is ground zero. And so the question is, and we know that atherosclerotic plaque happens when an LDL molecule in the subendothelial space becomes taken up by a macrophage. The macrophage essentially recognizes the LDL as a foreign molecule for some reason that we can get into. And it starts the formation of a foam cell in a macrophage, which is a precursor for a fatty streak, which grows into an atherosclerotic lesion. And so what we have is this competing hypotheses. And I think what Dave and I are both arguing is it doesn't make sense for it to be a concentration-driven phenomenon. There has to be a spark. And the analogy that I like is that you can have dry wood, but it's not going to ignite a fire unless you get a spark. And I would argue that LDL is dry wood, and that the spark is probably the endothelial injury or the endothelial dysfunction, and that in all the studies that we see, the people for whom LDL is the greatest risk factor are people in which they have other markers of endothelial dysfunction, people with metabolic syndrome, people with chronic inflammation. And we can see this reflected in things like HDL to triglyceride ratio, fasting insulin, inflammatory markers, glucose tolerance. So that I believe, and I think Dave would agree with this, is probably a better candidate for the actual proximate event of atherosclerosis rather than the LDL molecules doing that. And there are multiple arguments against the lipid hypothesis, including the numbers arguments. Yeah.
But I'm going to push back on one thing. I don't think of LDL particles as the dry wood.
Okay.
I think of them more as the flame retardant, right?
Okay. So, if we're thinking of repairing.
Right. In other words, I think a lot of people, and I say this in my speech, I think a lot of people are not necessarily pro-lipid hypothesis, but are pro-accelerant. And that's what that kind of sounds like. If you say, okay, the inflammatory response is the spark, and the more LDL particles you have, the bigger the fire is going to be because they are an accelerant. The more LDL particles, the more plaque you're going to have. And there's some good reason to follow this along because, indeed, people have very low levels of LDL. Like, let's say they have there's a condition known as A-beta lipoproteinemia, where they basically have nearly none. And those people will just not have atherosclerosis. And people who have familial hypo-beta lipoproteinemia, and those people just have extremely low levels, right? Almost as if they have natural PCSK9. And actually, there are people who have PCSK9 loss of function genes, for example. All of these people have super low levels, and they have super low levels of atherosclerosis. And this is basically kind of setting up an important segue. What do they not have? They don't have clearly superior lifespans. So even though they were, one would argue, blessed to have low levels of LDL, does that translate into a longer lifespan? It doesn't. And that should be curious, because this is why I come back to it being a containment strategy. I think atherosclerosis is potentially a giant containment strategy that, while it looks terrible to us from the outside, especially in observing people dying of heart attacks, it may in fact be something that the body is determined to generally be better than the alternative, which gets me back to the overworked hospital. Is you may still prefer not to be taking yourself or your loved ones to a hospital that's way overworked, but still think, given the alternative, I think I'll take that. But I just prefer there not be this natural disaster that's overworking them in the first place. So,
which would be the first event. So we keep coming back to this, the natural disaster. What do you think of, and I've kind of said endothelial dysfunction, endothelial injury. In your mind, what do you think is this natural disaster? What do you think is the proximate event of atherosclerosis?
Well, I have a new theory that I talked to you about briefly, and I'll just go ahead and state it plainly, because more and more I have to think through things mechanistically a lot. That's just how I'm wired. And the nature of the emergence of thrombose, just the whole pathogenesis of atherosclerosis and how it emerges and why it emerges in the way that it does and so forth. The one narrative that's made the most sense to me, and again, absolutely theoretical, I have no idea, is that actually we may not know the origination of an injury to the artery, but we may actually be observing a lack of repair to it. So it's not so much that a bad diet initiates the atherogenic event. It could be something else does. It could be there's something else that can actually create it, right? So it's not to say that that's the only case, but maybe there is a case in which it's not dysfunction. Maybe there is a case in which it's damage. Something gets into the diet, gets through the lymphatic system incorrectly, and that ultimately creates a problem that creates the issue, right? Obviously, things like smoking are crazy high levels of risk for cardiovascular disease. That brings in a lot of free radicals. So you get an injury that is supposed to be repaired and for which we seem to have plenty of processes in place to handle the repair effectively most of the time, until we don't, until there actually is an issue with the reparative process. And I think that's one of those times where the environment matters a lot, not in the initiation of the disease, but in the incapability of resolving the disease.
So do you think people with like metabolic syndrome, chronic inflammation are having trouble resolving these endothelial injuries? Is that why we see the correlation here?
Yes. And,
Okay.
and, and in a sense, maybe it's just the optimist in me. I see this as being possibly a very optimistic way of looking at it. That perhaps a lot of people who think they're just a lost cause because they're too far down the road. It may be about focusing on regaining that reparative health, if that makes sense.
I think it makes total sense. And we talked about this a little bit before we jumped on, the fact that there is no such thing as atherosclerosis in veins. And atherosclerosis only happens in arteries. And what we know is that arteries and veins are both blood vessels, and the arterial wall is a little different than the venous wall. But if anything, the major difference is the amount of pressure in the artery versus the vein. And what we see a lot of times for atherosclerotic plaques is they happen at arterial bifurcations where there's probably turbulence. And so I think this is actually really compelling and compatible with what you're saying, the idea that perhaps it's in arteries where there's higher pressure that you're getting more turbulent blood flow. This could be happening at arterial bifurcations. That is causing injury to the arterial wall, and that perhaps that's the beginning injury. And then the people with metabolic disease, chronic inflammation, metabolic syndrome, right, insulin resistance, perhaps these people are not as good at repairing the arterial injury, and then the plaque comes in to do that. Does that sound reasonable to you?
No, exactly that. And it explains to me why it is that you would see common places for where you would see the plaque emerge. So common points for, like the LAD being a very common place.
The left anterior descending artery in the heart.
Right. And of course, I mean, you got a lot of shear stress there, right?
Right.
So that makes sense. But at the same time, people will get it in other places. But the thing that never quite made a lot of sense to me is, why is it in say 2 places or 5 places when the gradient of the high LDL was like there the whole time? You'd expect it to be in 2,000 places.
It would be everywhere. Our arteries would be lined with plaque. It would just be it would be a coating of plaque from stem to stern. And it would also be potentially in the veins, maybe not, maybe if there's not enough injury. But that's the other point about the veins versus the arteries, is if it were purely a concentration-driven thing, why don't we get it in the veins? Perhaps it's the fact that we're saying here that there's more turbulence in the arteries. It's causing more endothelial injury. And if it were purely concentration-driven, why don't we just get arteries that are filled with cholesterol? Every artery is full of cholesterol, and it's just a matter of like how stenotic or how narrowed they all get, right? We only get these plaque in specific locations.
It's so imagine, here's another analogy for you, and it's really easy. Imagine there's a car accident on your main, throughway, and the car accident never gets cleared. It gets kind of moved off to the side, but never actually gets cured. So everybody tries to adapt to it. They try to like slow down as they're coming around and so on and so forth. But because it's never effectively getting cleared, it's only a matter of time until there's like a pileup over there, right? So it's what makes more sense to me, the lack of reparative aspect, that makes the nature of these plaques as they emerge more apparent. Mm-hmm. And that's why a lot of other things can make sense to me after that point, like how somebody can clean up their diet, like never mind whether it's low carb or not. Let's say that they just do more exercise and they do other things that improve their life. This sort of lifelong atherogenic burden doesn't seem to apply to the same degree. Like all of those years where they apparently had developed that burden, like a high score, suddenly becomes far less relevant when they take just a few years to really take their life back. I've observed this in some of my own family. I'm sure you've observed it in people that you really. Yeah, exactly. And so look, I can never state this enough. As a guy who worked on very complex systems that I'm very proud of, I am in awe coming back with engineering eyes to biology, which I couldn't wait to get out of in college. Like I was like, I'm done with this. I want to get on to writing code. Now I have a level of respect for this as a multifaceted system that I'm impressed that I took for granted, like so many other people that I know do now. That there's so many extraordinary reparative processes in place, things we can adapt to that just seem insane to try to think of mechanistically. Like there was another guy I was talking to who's also a former engineer getting into this space. And he was like, I just don't understand how we don't just die all the time, right? Like we should be dying way more than we do. How awesome is this machine that we're running that it can pull this off? And so let me segue into something that we wanted to be sure that we talked about, which was very central, really kind of more the end of my talk. And it gets back to this discussion on all-cause mortality. Why is all-cause mortality so relevant? Well, again, I care about whether or not this is a strategy. Is atherosclerosis, as crazy as this may sound, a strategy by design on the part of the body? It sounds insane, right? But then all you have to do is to look at the lipid hypothesis in the context of how people are surviving with or without high LDL. And for the longest time, literally years, you can look through my social media, Twitter especially, I've been like, I'm trying really hard to get a hold of a large data set so that I could find out for myself. Because most of the studies that are done on LDL cholesterol have to do with heart disease specifically. They don't look at all-cause mortality. And I don't like drug studies for a number of reasons I'm not even going to get into here. But I don't like them because what I'm wanting is to just instead look at people who are not on drugs, who don't have in any way a compromised chemically system, so that I could see of those people who are not on a statin, what their all-cause mortality would look like. And then lo and behold, about a month and a half ago, through the help of Tommy Wood and his team, I was able to get a hold of NHANES. NHANES is, I think, the largest North American data set on both diet and blood work.
Could be. Yeah.
But I didn't even care about diet. I just wanted to go straight to blood work. And to my delight, they have both lipids and mortality. So I didn't waste any time with even looking at heart disease. I just wanted to go straight for mortality. I wanted to find out what the mortality levels look like. And as I had in the talk, at first, I thought, oh, actually, as your LDL goes up, your all-cause mortality goes up. In other words, more LDL, more death. And then I started to look at what each of those stratifications showed, and the average age of each of them was lower to higher. In other words, the average age of people who had an LDL of 0 to 80 were 45.
Right.
And those people who had an LDL of 160 and up at the other end of the spectrum was 60. So I went, crap, I need to find where I can get age parity, so that I'm comparing LDL levels, but all at different ages. So eventually I found 50 and up.
Because as you noted in the talk, age is a risk factor for death.
Correct.
So unless as you're analyzing the NHANES data, unless you can look at LDL and total mortality in a group of people who are comparable age,
right,
then it's only accurate, right? Because of course, if people are 80 years old, they're going to die more often than people who are 40.
Particularly with each passing year.
Right.
Obviously it would be very unfair to compare 45-year-olds, rate of death compared to 60-year-olds. So fortunately, when I cut it exactly in half and went with those people 50 and up, I was able to get age parity. Each quantile, and I may be using that wrong, but basically each grouping that was divided into 6 different groupings, going from LDL 0 to 80, and then 20 at a time, all the way up to the 160 and higher. Their average age was 68 when going to 50 and above. So I was like, sweet, I got age parity. What's this look like? And genuinely, to my surprise, it was the exact reverse. The rate of death for those people with low LDL was higher than the rate of death for those people with high LDL. And that to a very large degree, we're not talking about it's about 5% difference. No, the people with an LDL of 0 to 80 were dying at a rate of about 3% per year. The people of, I want to say 80 to 100, at a rate of about 2.5% per year. And everybody above 100 was dying at a rate of about 2% per year. And that includes, at the far end, those people that had 160 and up. And this was a data set that I removed everybody who was on a statin. So these are all people who were on any statins.
And let's just be clear that previous to this, you had stratified, you had selected out for people who had the triad. This is looking at LDL levels in people who have high HDL, low triglycerides. This is not all people in the NHANES. You pulled out a group of NHANES. No, this is everybody.
This is just LDL.
Oh, okay.
LDL, not on statins.
Okay. Wow. All right.
No. Now, the triad that you mentioned, I did that afterwards.
Right.
And I saw that for every single one of those groupings, if you had an HDL of 50 or higher and a triglycerides of 100 or below, it improved your all-cause mortality, whichever group you're in.
Right. Okay.
So even if you have low LDL, you do better by having high HDL and low triglycerides. But regardless, no, even just LDL naked by itself.
Okay. So yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah. You had lower all-cause mortality the higher it was above age 50. And I was hoping for it to be flat, obviously. I was stunned to find it was not only the reverse, but that the effect size was that massive. And it's interesting. I put that slide online and got roundly the most attention I'd ever got from both directions. A lot of people praised it. A lot of critics pushed back and said, those people with low LDL are like just about to die. You know, they're wasting. So you don't usually have low LDL without a statin. But here's the thing. I already had blood work across all of them. So I was able to look at different things like albumin levels and neutrophils and all kinds of things that could be somewhat indicative. But on top of that, I had average follow-up time. Average follow-up time for those people at the low levels was 5.5 years. So there was definitely a very long follow-up time for everybody across the board. At some point, I want to do a little more of a substratification just to double check that. But for the most part, no. I mean, these were, and let me actually add one more thing. The real eye-opening moment for me was the centenarians. Centenarians refer to people who are age 100 or higher. And so I went straight for them. I wanted to find everybody who, and to kind of set this up a little bit better, this NHANES data spans from 1999 to 2015. That's all the lipids and all the mortality that they have. Well, they cap the age that they test at 85. So they don't have a lot of chance to have a lot of centenarians yet. Basically, class of 1999, 16 years later, those people are 100 or 101, and that's it. There's not going to be anybody above that age.
Right.
Okay. So there were exactly 5 living centenarians as of the last check in 2015. Of those 5, all of them had high LDL going from 130 up to 229. All of them had high HDL going from 50 and up. And 4 of the 5 had triglycerides below 100. The one odd person out had triglycerides of 229, which I'm pretty sure was because they were an unfasted test, I think. I don't know yet because I don't have the fasted data. But the point is, basically all of them had the triad. And this was tested in 1999. So everybody who was tested in 1999 who was 85, and I think there's 99 of them, if you had an LDL below 130, you didn't see 2015. But everybody who had the 130 and up, who had that triad in that group of those 5 people, those are the centenarians of the NHANES data. Not my data. It's their data. Isn't that crazy? Let me give you a quick analogy because I think this will really drive it home. If I told you the centenarians of the NHANES data are all 2-pack-a-day smokers, would that make sense to you?
No.
No, it wouldn't make any sense to you, right?
No.
You would go, I think you didn't carry the 4 somewhere, Dave, or something, right? But I have to use that analogy because that's the only way I can get it across to people who think of things just strictly in LDL. If high LDL means higher risk of death, this population shouldn't exist. And it's absolutely fine to say it could be total chance that these 5 people are the ones that happen to be the centenarians. But that's all the centenarians. That's why I brought up the 2-pack-a-day smokers. It's not that they have some marginally elevated LDL. It's like the mean average is 104. No, probably the mean average is something like 180, right? That's mind-blowing.
It's really incredible. And then the other stratification you did, I think, is really incredible and really valuable to see that. It kind of mirrors what we were talking about with the Japanese study as well, that look, in multiple big data sets now, when you adjust for age and you're looking across people, we don't see a connection between LDL and higher levels of death, or we see the reverse. We see people that have higher levels of LDL have less all-cause mortality. And it would be interesting, are you going to go back to that data set and look at the cardiovascular mortality in those people?
Yes. It's just been a time thing. I have a paper coming out for the energy model. I have a book that I promised both the people, the teams that I'm involved with both, that I'm going to be so on top of for Seattle. It's an irony, Paul, because I've been begging to have this data set forever, and mainly so that I could run just a few simple queries, which I now have showcased. And now I find I have the reverse problem. Now that I finally have a hold of it, I wish I could just spend all my time in it because it's so fascinating to be able to crunch this data. But yeah, it may be a little while until I turn that one around. But I also kind of don't want to. Look, we need some time to really have all-cause mortality in the spotlight. Full stop. Right. I can't emphasize this enough. I wish the conversation would start there. I wish whenever a doctor was telling a patient, you need to be on this drug, whatever the circumstances are, whatever the drug is, whatever the disease is, that the first thing the patient would go is, will it help me live longer? Will it help me live longer? Because if you've got studies that show me good, strong evidence that it'll help me live longer, that I will find compelling. But you have to start there. And if you want to make a case that, well, maybe it won't help you live longer, but it'll improve your quality of life because it'll reduce your chance of having cardiovascular risk, cardiovascular event that you may survive, but impacts your quality of life, right? I think that's fair. That's fair. But the problem gets back to what I was talking about in the talk. There's no study that's ever going to track every bad thing that can happen to you that includes non-cardiovascular events. So I always start with all-cause mortality. It's the one thing that's easy to measure. It's the one thing that we can look at with things like the NHANES data. Who survived, who didn't? And so for me, if I'm looking right now at these long-term survivors having high LDL, then I feel like the lipid hypothesis has some explaining to do.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And then, one of the other things you brought up in your talk at Low Carb Salt Lake was this idea that there have been a number of trials that have had subsections, or that there have had subgroups that had the triad, that had high HDL, low triglycerides, and high LDL. And just talk about those for a moment, because this is what I think would be most interesting for me to see with the NHANES data. I saw a talk where Ivor Cummins had taken the Framingham data and stratified the risk of cardiovascular disease with LDL based on 2 groups, people with high HDL and low HDL. Have you seen that slide that he has?
I haven't, but I think I know what this one is. And I think the problem is it doesn't stratify them together. It stratifies each on their own. Yes. In other words, one with LDL versus triglycerides, one with LDL versus HDL, but not one where it's like high HDL and low triglycerides. So to your point, it's true that the triad that I'm looking for is hard to find in the data because almost nobody does that substratification of all 3 of them together.
Right. I think that in the data that Ivor has, he was just looking at HDL, and he took people who had deaths by cardiovascular disease, and he looked at people who had high HDL, people who had low HDL, and he looked to see how well their LDL level correlated with cardiovascular disease. And what he found wasn't really surprising. It was that when you had a high HDL, the LDL level did not correlate with cardiovascular disease.
Right.
And when you had a low HDL, the LDL level does correlate with cardiovascular disease. And I thought that was so interesting. And I suspect you would see the same thing with the NHANES data. That would be my hypothesis, that if you're going to look at cardiovascular disease, if you would stratify it by high and low HDL, or HDL to triglyceride ratio, I bet we would see a divergent phenotype there, or a divergent outcome, showing, as was shown in this slide, that maybe LDL is only really a factor if you have other markers of disease, kind of like we've been talking about. Maybe LDL is only a problem if you have metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. These are synonyms, which would be indicated by low HDL, high triglycerides. But in people that don't have that, in people that have a triad, the HDL is high, the triglycerides are low, the LDL is high, doesn't seem, at least in that analysis, that LDL is really even playing a role in cardiovascular disease.
Well, and once again, I would say that LDL reflects the problem as opposed to is the driver of the problem. There's actually a term in the literature right now for the reverse of the triad. Those people who have low HDL and high triglycerides, and typically a high preponderance of small dense LDL particles. It's known as atherogenic dyslipidemia.
Right.
And so you can actually look right now, there's plenty of studies that show, hey, if you do have low HDL, high triglycerides, you're probably in trouble. You're going to be more likely to die of a cardiovascular disease. And again, this kind of comes back to, all right, is this again a situation where the environment drove the disease? And then LDL, of course, is like the overworked hospital that's trying to get involved to help save it, but can only do with what it's got, right? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I want to keep it on the table, because until we can actually determine, until we can disentangle its degree of being applied or called upon, then I don't know yet. I don't know what I can say about that.
Can we? I know we're going to wrap it up here shortly, because we've both overtaxed our brains. But can we just talk a little bit about why you think LDL rises on a ketogenic diet? I've always thought this is really interesting. So we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, this inversion pattern, which people who are familiar with your work will know, or if people are not familiar, they can go to cholesterolcode.com and see. When we're talking about the inversion pattern, it goes back to this nutrient trafficking idea that when you're eating a lot of fat, your body doesn't need to move fat to this periphery as much, and your LDL might go down a little bit. When you're fasting, the LDL might go up because it might be moving it. But at baseline, people tend to see elevated levels of LDL on ketogenic diets, carnivore diets. And I think this is a really interesting point to help people understand, because I think that even within a ketogenic diet, if you fast, your LDL is going to go higher. If you eat fat, it's going to go low, but it's still higher at baseline. So let's just talk a little bit about this so people understand why LDL might go up on a ketogenic diet and why this might not be a big problem.
And for what it's worth, there's a guide that we have on cholesterolcode.com. I think it's a simple guide. I think it's called A Simple Guide to Cholesterol on Low Carb. And effectively, this is the gist of it, and it's basically the basis for my energy model. You and I right now, we're making a choice to be powered more by fat than by carbohydrates. Before we did this, if we're powered more by carbohydrates, then therefore our primary energy substrate is going to be glucose. And the thing about glucose is it's water soluble. It's good to go. Like once we go ahead and get in the bloodstream, floats along just fine. But triglycerides, and for that matter, fatty acids themselves, they're not water soluble. They're like oil with water. And since the blood is water soluble, this is where the body is genius in making these boats, these lipoproteins. And you and I both mentioned, we talked about how there's triglycerides and there's cholesterol, but the truth is there's lots of other things like fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, for example, that also will likewise get packaged in these boats to be sent out for our cells. Well, if I'm deciding to be powered more by fatty acids, then that definitely means that instead of glucose, my body's going to be trafficking more of them and therefore needing to make and circulate more of these boats. The primary boat, as I mentioned earlier, that's going to be circulated, especially in absence of eating, is going to be the VLDLs that come from the liver. And that's why LDL cholesterol going up makes perfect sense to me. It makes sense to me because while I'm on the metabolic pathway of being powered by fatty acids, even if I make more ketones, and I know we all love to talk about ketones because ketones are just an interesting new word. Truth is, and I like to say this a lot, we're actually on fatty acid diets. Mm-hmm. And ketones are certainly a big part of it, but they're not really the biggest part of it. The biggest part of it is actually direct delivery of fatty acids to our cells. And particularly if you're active, if you're working out a lot, I think that there's a conscious decision on the part of the body to traffic more of these direct fatty acids because, again, getting back to skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, if that's their preferred substrate, the body's pretty smart about making that available to them. And that's why a lot of times you'll find people who are like very sedentary will have very high levels of ketones relative to those people who are big fitness, like the lean mass hyperresponders. They often complain because their ketone levels will get, say, 0.3 to 1.0 millimoles.
Right.
But those people who are sedentary will have like 2 or 3 and so forth. But I believe that's because their body wisely is now saying, okay, well, we can break down more of these into ketones because we're pretty much just fueling the brain. We need the ketones for the brain. So being powered more by fatty acids, I believe, necessitates more trafficking of very low density lipoproteins, especially, meaning more low density lipoproteins, and therefore meaning more cholesterol, low density lipoprotein cholesterol. Now, there are other factors, Paul, I should go ahead and mention. It's not just as simple as that. It does matter just how low carb you are, because I think if you have a certain threshold of glycogen stores, this is also part of my research. For example, if I were to have around 100 carbs a day, my LDL would be substantially lower, maybe even half of what it is right now. And I believe that this makes sense because in the part of the body, it's trying to traffic a short-term energy supply appropriately, unless it already has enough of a short-term energy supply in the form of glycogen. And therefore it knows it can release enough, and therefore it doesn't need to traffic as much on the fatty acid side. There's also things like polyunsaturated fatty acids, which can also bring down your LDL through a myriad of different mechanisms, but they are also preferentially quarantined in the pathway of ketogenesis. And that's not my way of recommending them, by the way. I'm actually not a big fan of PUFAs. Fiber can also have an effect, and one of the most predominant explanations for that is because it forces a greater sequestration towards bile acid, which puts more towards your liver to express more LDL receptors to pull more out of the inventory that's in the blood. Things along those lines. And of course, genetics. All of these things can modulate a little bit of what that baseline is. But with all of that said, if I were to go down to the gym, find a whole bunch of runners who are lean, and I put them all on a ketogenic diet, I'll bet 80% of them at least would be lean mass hyperresponders.
Meaning they would have LDLs that go up very high to these very high levels, above 200 milligrams per deciliter. And we talked about it a little earlier. Saturated fat will raise LDL. And hopefully at this point in the podcast, people will say, okay, saturated fat might raise LDL. Maybe that's not a bad thing. And this is probably just biochemistry. I think this is the biochemistry of how these fats are trafficked and moved, right? I mean, what is the mechanism by which saturated fat raises LDL?
So that takes a bit more unpacking, but I'm going to give, it's funny, packing is part of it itself. Short version is the more single carbon chain fatty acids you're using, the more they're going to be preferentially trafficked in the direction of like very low density lipoproteins. Again, getting back to how I was saying PUFAs tend to be preferentially trafficked in the direction of ketogenesis. That means there's less of them that are actually going to get secreted. Right, as VLDL. As VLDLs. But on top of that, there's another issue internal to the liver that I really credit Siobhan for finding. It's really fascinating. There's a great paper that talks about how at certain thresholds of PUFAs, you have in the I guess you could say the synthesis of these very low density lipoproteins, if there's too many PUFAs, it'll actually scrap it and then restart. And so there's a production process for which there's an assembly, if you will, and the assembly can get restarted several times if it's failing at doing that. But again, I don't see this as net positive. I want it to succeed at the assembly, and if it's doing that more with saturated fatty acids, I'm not seeing so much of a problem with that. If that's, and again, we'll see long term. We don't know for sure. But I can say this. I can say that if there's more preferential trafficking of fatty acids in the form of VLDLs, I just don't see that as a net negative until I can see some data behind it with either my existing blood tests or anything else. I seem to have the best blood work when I'm on a very high saturated fatty acid ketogenic diet. That's how it looks to me right now.
And what do you mean by the best blood work? What would be the best blood work for you?
Low inflammatory markers My liver enzymes look fantastic. My
AST and ALT.
yeah, AST, ALT look great. CRP looks great. My I also will get things from time to time like TNF alpha and IL-6. And I'm not saying that saturated fatty acids will necessarily impact that as much as the actual disease that could cause the inflammatory response. But I'm just saying the most pristine ones I have are when I'm actually just hardcore keto, like if I'm doing my baseline diet, my LDL can get like really high, but all my markers look amazing. It's probably pretty close to how I would look as a lean mass hyperresponder.
Or carnivore.
Or a carnivore, that's true.
Because
Although
you've experimented with that.
I have. Although here's an irony. On carnivore, I had much higher levels of BHB, of ketones.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
It surprised me. But I also had the tightest glucose homeostasis. Like it was just a flat line.
Right.
And I kind of half expected that either I was going to see more of a like marginal jump, or I was going to see a drop. Like if there really was more of an insulinemic effect from the protein, that we would see kind of a drop of the existing glucose levels if there wasn't more gluconeogenesis in play. But I didn't see that. Or if there was, it was so homeostatic, I could hardly follow the difference. Carnivore is like the most homeostatic I've ever seen my glucose ever.
I've seen it too. I mean, I shared Nathan's continuous blood glucose monitor on my Instagram, and it's basically a flat line. You know, it doesn't move at all. So, you know, I just want to talk about one more thing before we wrap it up, and I just want to let people know that a lot of the studies that have been done on people with high LDLs are done on people who have familial hypercholesterolemia. And Dave kind of hinted at this earlier, that he wanted to exclude genetic studies. And I just want to say a word about FH, and I can talk more about this. I'm going to get David Diamond on the show probably to talk about FH. But, you know, there's this idea that we really don't have studies of people with LDL cholesterols above 200 milligrams per deciliter who do not have familial hypercholesterolemia. But, and so there are basically, and we talked about this after our steak dinner, there are basically two ways to achieve an LDL greater than 200, becoming either low-fat keto or high-fat keto carnivore or familial hypercholesterolemia. We don't even, and the problem is that in the literature, those two things get conflated, and they should not be, because of something that we will talk about here briefly. And I want people to understand that it's very hard to study this, and what Dave is doing is very unique because it's a very unique phenotype to see the triad, to see high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides. We've never seen this before. It's only on a ketogenic diet that we see this, right? So we cannot cannot rely entirely upon the familial hypercholesterolemia data to direct us in that sense, because, as I'll let Dave explain it, but why can't we use the FH data to give us a sense of what people like that will have in terms of their outcomes?
Well, of course, it's not comparable physiology. Something that I draw attention to, so let me actually set this up a little bit by bringing up and acknowledging David Diamond's work. He was really pointing out the issue with coagulation factor, that if you compared those people with FH who had like no coagulation factor relative to those who did, then those who did were the ones who tended to have the problems.
No hypercoagulability.
Right. Now, I have to also give a shout out to Siobhan Huggins, who at this last conference actually asked a question of David Diamond, because I wasn't aware of this myself before. But I think it was coagulation factor 8 gets cleared by LDL receptors. And if that's true, that's highly relevant, because the classic version of familial hypercholesterolemia is the mutation on the LDL receptor. That's part of why it doesn't get cleared from the bloodstream as much, as the LDL receptors don't bind to it and clear it, particularly at the liver. And that's kind of a big deal if that's leaving more of the clotting factor in play, clotting factor 8, if that's creating the issue. Again, we're running into this problem in that we're comparing a compromised physiology
exactly
with a dietary outcome associated with the higher LDL. The vast majority of people, really almost nobody that's in, for example, the lean mass hyperresponder group, has found SNPs that are associated with being FH. And of course, it's pretty obvious to know if you've got it, because typically before you went keto, you already had crazy high levels of cholesterol. And you probably also know because it probably ran into your family as well. Like people were dying a lot earlier, and there's other signs such as xanthomas and so forth that make that a little more obvious. Well, that's a big deal if you're using that as sort of the basis to determine the lipid hypothesis, because if it's a compromised physiology, you've got to first determine for sure that what the compromise is strictly LDL levels. And that's part of what I address in my talk, is that my problem is if you're already looking at incapability of cells to take up LDL receptor or LDL particles because they have mutated LDL receptors, that is its own confounder. And I call that lipid malabsorption. So I wanted to look at anything I could find that were SNPs that didn't have lipid malabsorption but did have alterations in LDL cholesterol. And we found, I want to say, something like 26. And this is something Siobhan did for like a few weeks. And we were only able to find one that confirmed heart disease, but we were able to find one that confirmed no heart disease with high levels of LDL. But then there were 24, 25 that were not investigated. Non-lipid metabolism-based SNPs that were just straight up not investigated, which was very, I don't want to say curious in a conspiratorial way, but I will say it's a bit frustrating that they didn't pursue that they seem to only want to look at SNPs that do two things, that change the LDL levels and have that lipid malabsorption potential. Because I think that could be problematic, because other things that impact endothelial cell functionality can also result in atherosclerosis. So let's look at only the ones that don't impact that, in addition to changing LDL levels. Does that make sense?
Yes. And so basically, we're using more acronyms here, SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. And what Dave is saying is that when we look at people with familial hypercholesterolemia, we didn't say this, but there are thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms that can give someone familial hypercholesterolemia. What he was looking for in his research with Siobhan were single nucleotide polymorphisms that did not affect lipid transport into the cell. That is, single nucleotide polymorphisms that resulted in high LDL, but that were not in or involving the LDL receptor or involving this sort of LDL metabolism. And what Dave is saying is that they're very hard to find. There were 26. Unfortunately, only 2 were studied, and we wish we had data on the other 26, because it's sort of this interesting idea. Those would be more interesting things for FH. If we can say, all right, the LDL is high, but they're not affecting LDL receptor metabolism, LDL metabolism. And what we're saying with FH, this is the work of David Diamond, I believe, is that many people with familial hypercholesterolemia also have concomitant hypercoagulability. They are prone to clotting. And I think he's shown, I'll get him on the show, I think he's shown that if you look at people with FH who have clotting, a tendency toward clotting versus people who don't have a tendency toward clotting, you see a real difference in outcomes, again suggesting it's not the LDL. Most likely it could be something else. But generally people who espouse the lipid hypothesis point to the FH trials. And what I'm trying to bring up here with Dave is to highlight the idea, when you're pointing to the familial hypercholesterolemia trials, we have to be very careful of the details.
Well, and again, if the lipid hypothesis is true, then it should apply to all populations, all sexes, all ages. It should be as it's described, dose dependent and log linear. And in that regard, we should be able to remove selectively genetic studies. And that's my problem with these Mendelian randomizations, is oftentimes I don't feel like they are properly exclusive of potential confounding factors. There actually are like over 100 different SNPs that are associated with LDL changes that are not lipid metabolism. But we were being intellectually honest and wanted to exclude those that impact, for example, HDL and triglycerides. But we could have snuck those in there and probably had a list that looked even more attractive. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to isolate it down to the ones that we could say were truly defensible. And I just, honestly, Paul, I wish that there was just a lot more of a push like that right now in the science, particularly in studying atherosclerosis and its association with LDL.
Well, I think there's got to be in the future. I mean, I think that it's very clear that ketogenic diets are incredibly useful for people. They're incredibly helpful. I'm a big advocate for nose-to-tail carnivore diets. And like we're saying in this talk, for a lot of people, those type of diets are going to send LDL high. And I hope that this podcast will be the beginning of discussions or the continuation of discussions around why that may not be a big deal. And I hope physicians will listen to this. I hope people who are, talking to physicians, I hope patients will listen to this and bring this talk to their physicians or bring ideas that you've suggested in the past to their physicians, so we can start to challenge this notion that high LDL is always the same, and that there's a lot of, and really bring up the idea that there's a lot of nuance in high LDL. For some people who are metabolically sick, high LDL can be a problem. But for lean mass hyperresponders, for the majority of people doing keto and carnivore diets, they're incredibly metabolically healthy, and it's not an issue. It's just not an issue, and I don't want this high. I'm going to say it, man. I'm going to say I'm cautiously optimistic.
Right. I'm not going to say I know categorically. I just want to emphasize that. Look, I'm probably more optimistic than I've ever been.
Right.
But I got to be a good scientist. I can't say that I know for sure.
And I mean, I'm a physician, I got to try and be a good physician and say, yeah, we'll never know. But in my opinion, it's very clear that this is not, that LDL is not the end of the story here. And there's a lot of nuance, and I really appreciate you sort of bringing this to the forefront. I really appreciate so much of your work. Now, the last thing I want to ask you, I just hope this will bring it home, and we sort of touched on this and then we skirted around it, so I want to circle back to it, is have you seen regression of atherosclerotic plaque in people with high LDL? Meaning, have you seen people regress atherosclerotic plaque while having a high LDL?
Yes, definitely. Well, let me put it this way. I've had people send me data on their having done that.
So you've been sent data that people had persistently high LDL and then had reduction in coronary artery calcium scoring or other indices of regression of atherosclerosis. Now,
CAC is a different story. And actually, Ivor will have some data on this. I haven't seen as much in that area.
Right.
But I want to, let me actually modulate a little bit. It's very difficult to truly track atherosclerotic plaque in vivo. It's a real challenge. So I'll just say markers have improved. CIMT is obviously one that I've shown myself, but I don't really know how much of that is true plaque, and I'm doubtful that it's like even the majority. There's the ankle brachial, I'm going to misstate it, but which one I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Right. I've seen that one improve. These are all proxies, but they're not really the actual, it'd be great if we had something like an ultrasound that perfectly determined what was indeed, macrophages with a sterol inside. That'd be great. Once we have that kind of detector, science will advance a lot faster. But no, I've seen what I would say is very compelling evidence to me from lean mass hyperresponders. But I say it's compelling, but it's still anecdotal.
Right. And I'll have to get Ivor on and talk to him about the coronary artery calcium scan data. But I think that once we can start to show that coronary atherosclerosis or peripheral arterial disease is regressing in people who are doing ketogenic diets with high LDL or the triad, high HDL, low triglycerides, that's really compelling. That really puts the lipid hypothesis to bed. Wait a minute. This guy's got an LDL of 350 and his coronary artery calcium score is lower. So what do you think about that? Clearly there's more to the story. And I think that, I've stated this pretty clearly in the past. And I think, people will have no question about my opinion that there's a lot more to the story than just, high LDL, go on a statin.
And that's really the single most important thing we need to get to is I'm sure it will get changed over to, well, there's more to the story. Or for that matter, that it may be other factors that are in the lives of the lean mass hyperresponders are proving to be more relevant than the crazy super high levels of LDL they are. But that's a huge back step, even just to do that. Because right now, the existing guidelines, and I had this in my talk, the existing guidelines say straight up 190 milligrams per deciliter or higher LDL with no other qualifiers, and you should be on the maximally dosed statin. So, I mean, the theory is strong, very strong amongst so many doctors that I've talked to even be able to say, oh, we now have some very compelling evidence that on a low-carb diet and given these markers, especially having low triglycerides and high HDL, that would be world-changing. If they were to even say, okay, well, maybe in that context, it's okay. I'd be like, okay, well, that's a huge chunk of everybody that's in the low-carb world.
It's huge. It's huge. And I think that that's like you said to me after dinner, it's the sharp end of the spear. I think this is going to be the thing that dissuades people from doing these diets. They say, oh, I can't. I've had countless people message me. I did it and my LDL went super high. My doctor's worried. What should I do? And hopefully this is a continuation of the discussion saying, don't freak out. Let's look at the data. We're cautiously optimistic. This is not the same thing. We're going to change. I really think we're going to change the paradigm. And I think, nose-to-tail carnivore diets are incredibly beneficial for people from an immunologic standpoint. And potentially nose-to-tail carnivore diets and ketogenic diets can change this underlying first event, whatever is causing the endothelial injury or whatever is causing the body to not be able to repair this endothelial injury. That, I think, can be modified with metabolically health-giving diets like ketogenic carnivore diets. So I think that's the answer, in my opinion. That's what we need to be doing. And I love that we're just like saying, oh, there's a big roadblock here. Let's just climb over it. We're gonna totally change the whole paradigm. So I love it, Dave. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Hopefully people have found this interesting. I know we kind of went high level, low level, high level, low level. If people get lost, watch this multiple times, look at Dave's work. Where can people find you? What do you have coming up? I'm sure people are going to want to look at more of your stuff.
Well, of course, cholesterolcode.com is our resource hub. I'm obviously very active on Twitter, Dave Keto. But in particular, I'm going to be putting a lot of focus over the next couple months into putting together the paper, the energy model paper we hope to have ready. I'm working with both Siobhan Huggins and Tommy Wood. I'm putting that together. And the book, which books are hard. I don't know if you knew this, but you probably do. They're quite a lot of work. And so I've got to kind of sink in as we're sort of in the stretch. And I'm hoping that we can get it released this year. So we'll see how that goes.
Too. Yeah, I do know books are hard. I'm writing one myself and I'm hoping to get it released at the same time. So maybe you and I can high five in December and eat a steak celebrating the release of our respective books. That would be amazing.
I look forward to it.
And we didn't, you and I didn't get to have a conversation about the social stuff. Maybe we can do that in the future, but I just want people to know, Dave's history. Dave is an engineer. Dave is doing this out of his personal passion. He could be making way more money doing software stuff. He is just obsessed with sharing this information, and he's really kind of burning the candle at both ends. And it's really, I think, very courageous and laudable that Dave is saying, I'm not going to chase that because I'm so passionate about this. So we'll get Dave back on and we'll talk about sort of his personal motivations for just doing something that he's super passionate about, which I think is a really interesting story as well. But for now, Dave, thank you, my friend. It's been a pleasure. I can't wait till we talk again. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. All right. I stopped my recording if you want to stop yours. Yeah, I actually was getting kind of tired.